And of course, in order to save the group from being overwhelmed by racial tensions, queerness comes in to kind of break up the tension that threatens the smooth sailing of the Glee Club. But what happens in this concept of we are all minorities, it reinscribes white supremacy through the guise of diversity. So now keep in mind that this show has received the award of diversity. And Glee seems to offer its privileged heteronormative white folks the opportunity to say, yes, if we slip out of the rightful social sphere, we too can be minorities. And this allows whites to say, this group, this new we, is now a diverse we, and we have come so far. This is harmful to whites, but most certainly it is more harmful to people who have fallen outside the definitions of normal citizenship in the United States. People who have been oppressed and fetishized, specifically people of color, the disabled, the queer community, and women. Is Glee the gayest show ever? According to some critics, yes. Is it a gay thing that should be held up as an example of how far we have come? No. So whose queer identity is this? Is it the queer identity that is not challenging the fact that certain current movements for equality are hypocritical in the sense that they can't seem to acknowledge other forms of oppression and instead want equal rights to partake in an institution that is historically oppressive, but also structured around the notion of white supremacy? Is it queerness that is used by capitalism in order to diversify the pillars of racism, sexism, and ableism that it utilizes and thrives on? No. This is not the queerness that should be held up as an idea of progress. And this is most certainly not going to be my queer identity. In a time where US discourses revolving around queerness and gay identity increasingly become wrapped up in marriage equality and capitalist consumption, it can be difficult to feel empowered when resisting such forces. But conversations like the ones that we are having in this room today need to happen, and apparently are happening, in hopes that there will be a world where queered and race bodies are no longer oppressed, and if this is not only a hypothesis, but becomes a reality. Thank you.
Next we have Anita Halas. She is a recent graduate from SUNY Stony Brook and has a certificate in women's studies. And her presentation is titled Misremembering the Butch, A Return to Butch Femme Culture.
I want to say thank you to all the conference organizers for gifting us with this space where we can share our personal knowledges and create new ones together. So what I offer you today is in no way a complete history of butch femme culture. In fact, I don't even intend to make it a comprehensive history. I want to provide you with a very basic understanding and chronology of butch identity and butch femme sexuality in order to help link the past to our present. I also want to say that at this point in my research, the descriptive components primarily focus on butch identity. However, for my future research, I definitely do intend and am already in the process of researching femme identity as well. It started off as butch identity for personal identification reasons. So this project is concerned with how butch lesbian identities and butch femme relationships have been produced and reproduced and remembered and misremembered over time within a heterosexist and homophobic framework. I first began my research by looking at two frequent accusations made against butches and butch femme relationships, that butch lesbians are trying or want to be men, and that butch femme relationships are an imitation of heterosexuality. These accusations have been historically maintained by the assumptions that masculinity cannot exist outside of the male body, and that heterosexuality is in some way natural or intrinsic to the human condition, both making queer sexualities abnormal. Darius Rejali, a professor of political science, wrote an article on modern-day torture, which has absolutely nothing to do with my presentation, but in that article he stated that whenever we ask ourselves why something is still happening, it's a sign that something's wrong with the way that we understand our past. In my thinking about modern-day definitions and memories of butch femme lesbians and butch femme relationships, I wondered why we still hold on to the idea that a masculine female must be a lesbian, or why in a lesbian relationship one is the man and the other the woman. These historically pervasive ideas, enforced by the sex-gender system and heterosexual power, made it clear to me that there is something wrong with the way that we understand lesbian history. What I hope you will all do with me today is think about why certain characteristics of identity are preserved and why others are forgotten, and why butches and butch femme sexualities have been identities of abjection and imitation as opposed to ones of resistance and desire. This is a descriptive project that examines lived experience through the changing political and social climates. Therefore, I don't intend to engage in a process of proving or disproving claims made against the butch and femme. I also do not offer definitions for butch and femme beyond this. That the butch is generally understood to be a lesbian with masculine characteristics and a femme a lesbian with feminine characteristics. Even these definitions, however, are not representative because what exactly does masculine and feminine look like on the level of the individual, and how does it or can it change for a group? The complementarity of butch femme is perceived differently by different women and therefore cannot be strictly defined. Throughout my project, I argue that the butch identity and butch femme relationships are misremembered within and beyond queer and feminist communities and discourse. And that kind of brings in what was initially said at the start of the conference: how can queer theory and feminist theory interact, and what kinds of contentions existed between the two. And I do briefly touch on the contentions between queer identity and feminist identity a little bit later. So by using the term misremember, I refer to a history that is lacking rather than a history that's wrong. My goal is not to prove a particular history to be true, but rather to show how histories can be forgotten, sometimes with intent. The question I want to answer today is, how are butches and butch femme sexualities misremembered? So the following are ways in which I believe lesbian histories have been forgotten through history. And I'm just going to have a little bit of visual entertainment in the back while I read. So, in order for us to understand present-day ideas we hold about butches and femmes, it is crucial that we understand how they navigated the past. One way histories are forgotten is through this inability to connect the past with the present. This is the most important goal in my project, to make clear how the past structures our present and how it can structure our future. Scholarly work on butch femme culture predominantly begins in the 1930s. However, it's imperative that we recognize the existence of lesbian relationships prior to the 1930s. Although lesbian consciousness and the language used to define lesbian was not what it is today, women of the 19th and 20th centuries coexisted in loving relationships, sometimes romantic relationships, sometimes Boston marriages, and sometimes one partner passing as a man. A variety of social and political factors contributed to the rise of lesbian consciousness and visibility. The political demands of 19th and 20th century women regarding equal access to education, employment, and politics provided women with financial independence. They no longer had to rely on men for financial support and were now able to support each other. Medical classifications of intimacy between women as sexual deviance and sexual inversion, while stigmatizing, also opened up a space for the formation of lesbian subcultures. Many lesbian women during the early 20th century, when sexological texts and diagnoses were rampant, internalized the characteristics of the sexual invert and the mannish lesbian. Many of the characteristics appealed to them and even matched their desire to be strong and independent women in loving relationships with other women. It allowed them to form subcultures and finally stop feeling as though they were alone. The publication of Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness and many other 20th century pulp novels presented society with representations of lesbianism. The Well of Loneliness was a British lesbian novel published in 1928 that brought attention to sexual inversion as a state of being, and many lesbians use this book as a source of information about lesbianism, and it also had a tremendous effect on individual and relational lesbian formation within groups. The commercialization of entertainment and the importance placed on leisure activities like dance halls, bars, theaters, films provided lesbians with spaces for socialization. Greater social emphasis on sex as pleasure encouraged women's sexual autonomy and removed pleasure from the need to reproduce. And the financial and social effects of World War II had a great impact on women entering the workforce and creating spaces where they could meet. And although media representations of celebrities did not directly influence the increase of lesbian visibility, it did influence butch fashion and attitude. 1950s male celebrities like Elvis Presley and Marlon Brando, who actually just recently found out was openly bisexual, were the epitome of masculinity. Many butch lesbians adopted the look, as you can see, white t-shirt, jeans, slicked back, short hair, and the attitude of the tough guy and the rebel. So these celebrities were figures that represented masculinity to them.